A fisherman noticed a strange object in the muddy swamp. What he discovered when he began to clean it completely shocked him. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning broke slowly over the wetlands, pulling a thin veil of light through the gray mist that hung over the water. The surface of the bayou looked like tarnished glass, scattered with drifting leaves and the trembling reflections of cypress knees jutting out like dark fingers. The air was thick, humming with the steady buzz of unseen insects. Everything smelled of mud and salt and something old, something that never quite dried. Nathan Carter eased his boat into the shallow current, the wood creaking beneath his boots as he balanced a bucket beside the stern. The river, wide and brown, curved like an animal's back, and Nathan had known every turn of it since he was a boy. He knew where the mud would hold him fast if he stepped too far from the root, where the catfish hid between the submerged logs, where the mist gathered thicker than smoke. The bayou was his livelihood, his inheritance, and his curse all at once. He pushed his pole through the soft bottom and steered toward a cove he hadn't visited since before the storm. It had rained hard the night before, the kind of rain that stripped the topsoil from the bank and carried pieces of the world into the river. When storms passed like that, the water fell back to reveal what it had swallowed. Nathan liked mornings like this. They carried silence, an uneasy, raw kind of silence that told him the bayou was listening too. The frogs were quiet. The air had weight. He rowed until the mist began to clear, until the sun broke low through the trees and cast long copper streaks across the current. His nets rested neatly, folded at his feet, his hands working by habit, tying lines, checking hooks, muttering small reminders to himself. He wasn't a man who needed company. Most of his days were spent alone on this water, and that was how he preferred it. The world outside was too fast, too loud. Here, the pace was dictated by the slow rise and fall of the river, by the sudden call of a heron or the plop of a turtle sliding into the water. Nathan cast his line with a gentle swing, watching the lure fall with a small ripple. He leaned back against the edge of the boat and let the stillness soak into him. But something in that stillness changed. It began subtly, the kind of thing most men wouldn't notice, the faint shift of birdsong, the hush of wind that suddenly stopped moving through the reeds. Nathan sat forward. The air felt heavier. About 50 feet downstream, something caught the light. A shape, broad and dark, pressed against the muddy shore. At first glance, it looked like the fallen trunk of a large tree, one of those that the current sometimes uprooted during storms. But even from a distance, the edges looked too straight, too deliberate. The thing stretched along the bank, half buried in silt, its outline blurred by grime. Nathan pulled his line back and rested the rod beside him. He squinted through the morning haze. The shape didn't move. Not exactly, but the way the water clung to its surface seemed unnatural. The mud around it looked freshly turned, as if something had shifted beneath it overnight. His instincts, trained by years on the river, told him it didn't belong there. He reached for the pole and angled the boat closer, pushing gently through the shallow water until the bow scraped the edge of the bank. He stepped onto the soft ground, the mud gripping his boots with a wet sigh. The smell was stronger here, earthy, sour, the kind that came when the bottom of the river was disturbed. He crouched, resting his hands on his knees, and looked closely. The shape was about 15 feet long, wide as a small raft, and the surface wasn't bark at all. It was smoother, darker, coated in layers of sludge and river moss. When Nathan brushed his fingertips across it, he felt ridges, parallel lines like seams of wood planks pressed together. A raft, he thought. An old one. The realization didn't comfort him. There shouldn't have been a raft this deep in the marsh, not in this section. The last people who had tried to cross these waters on makeshift planks had vanished decades ago. The locals said the swamp took what it wanted and kept it. Nathan's father used to tell him stories about it when he was a boy, how the bayou could open beneath a man without warning and close again like a mouth. He'd learned early not to chase mysteries in this place, and yet his curiosity was stronger than his caution. He knelt and scraped at the mud with the side of his hand. Beneath the crust, wood glistened wet and dark. His fingers slid over something rough, a strand of metal maybe. He dug carefully, revealing a rusted chain coiled around one corner of the structure. It was thick, each link fused with reddish corrosion, the kind of chain used to anchor boats or bind cargo. He followed it with his eyes until it disappeared beneath the water. Whatever this was, it had been locked in place deliberately. Nathan frowned. The more he uncovered, the stranger it became. He glanced around, half expecting someone else to appear on the bank, another fisherman maybe, but there was no one. Only the trees leaning close like silent witnesses. The raft was old, perhaps older than him, but the design was precise, wide beams, evenly spaced, bound tight. He shifted closer and pressed the mud away from the center. There, beneath the grime, he felt something different, softer. When he brushed away the top layer, the edge of a canvas sheet emerged, waterlogged and torn in one corner. He tugged gently, and the edge lifted with a sucking sound. Beneath it lay a small, compact bundle, wrapped in decayed rope. Nathan hesitated. The sight of it unsettled him. Things left wrapped and hidden in the swamp rarely meant anything good. He told himself it was probably trash, old supplies from a forgotten fishing camp. But he couldn't leave it alone. He pried the knot apart, and the rope fell away like wet straw. Inside was a weather-beaten metal box about the size of a loaf of bread. Its surface was streaked with green patina, the lock crusted shut. The box looked heavy, solid, sealed for decades. He set it aside and continued to scrape. The mud came away slowly, clinging to his fingers. As he worked, another glint caught his eye, a shard of glass maybe. He leaned closer and uncovered a thin rectangle pressed flat against the wood. It was a photograph, sealed in a plastic sleeve gone yellow with age. The image was faint, but he could make out the faces. A young woman holding a baby, both looking straight into the camera. The corners of the photo were warped, but a faint line of writing could still be read on the back through the transparency. The words were smeared, yet one phrase was clear enough to make him still his hand. "If anyone finds this, tell my daughter." A chill crawled over Nathan's skin. He turned the photo in his hand, the water dripping down his wrist. The woman's eyes seemed to follow him even through the fading print. Whoever she was, she'd left this here intentionally. He could almost see her in his mind, standing somewhere on this very bank years ago, placing the bundle onto the raft before the swamp claimed it. Nathan looked back at the metal box. The lock was rusted, but it still held firm. He thought about prying it open right there, but the sound of a splash nearby made him pause. He straightened, scanning the water. A ripple moved through the reeds about 20 feet away, then another, slower this time. Probably a gator, he told himself, but the unease in his gut didn't fade. He tucked the photograph into his pocket and gathered the box and canvas bundle in his arms. The weight of the metal felt heavier than it should. The mud sucked at his boots as he made his way back to the boat. He laid the items carefully at his feet and pushed off from the shore, the pole dipping deep into the riverbed. The water was calm again, almost too calm. The sun had risen higher now, cutting through the mist, revealing a sky as pale as tin. As he drifted away, he glanced over his shoulder at the dark shape half submerged in the mud. It looked unchanged, but the sight of it pressed against him like a memory that didn't belong to him. He told himself he would take the box home, dry it out, and call the sheriff's office after lunch. That was the sensible thing to do. Yet, as the boat glided back toward the channel, a thought he couldn't shake crept into his mind. Someone had gone through great trouble to hide this raft, to chain it down, to keep it from floating away. Someone had meant for it never to be found. The frogs began their chorus again as the boat moved farther downstream. The swamp was waking up, returning to its ordinary rhythm as if nothing had happened. But Nathan could feel it deep in his bones. The river had changed for him. The air itself seemed to hum with something old and unresolved. He looked at the photo once more before tucking it safely into his tackle box. The handwriting on the back was fading, but the plea was clear enough to bind him. By the time he reached the dock near his house, the sun was high and the day had turned sharp with heat. The insects screamed in the reeds, the air dense and sticky. Nathan lifted the metal box from the boat, water dripping from its edges, and carried it up the worn steps to his porch. Behind him, the river gurgled softly, as if sighing after a secret finally spoken aloud. He set the box down on the table beside his nets and stood over it for a long time. He could hear the distant croak of frogs, the faint rumble of an engine somewhere down the road, and his own breathing. Everything about the morning had been ordinary until that shape in the mud. Now, even the light seemed different. The swamp had given him something, and whether it was a gift or a warning, he couldn't yet tell. As he looked toward the tree line, he thought he saw a flicker of movement between the shadows, a ripple that wasn't wind, a dark figure that might have been a trick of the light. He blinked, and it was gone. But the unease stayed with him, sharp and silent. The bayou was never empty, he knew that much. It watched and remembered, and today it had chosen him to remember something long buried. Nathan turned back to the table, resting his hand on the damp lid of the box. The metal was cold beneath his fingers, colder than it had any right to be under the Louisiana sun. He would open it later, he decided. First, he needed to think. The photograph lay beside it, the faces blurred but alive somehow. The woman, the child, the raft chained to the bank. All of it formed a pattern he didn't yet understand. Inside his house, the floorboards creaked as he stepped inside, the sound echoing softly through the small space. The smell of coffee and river air filled the room. He set the box on the counter and washed the mud from his hands, watching the brown water swirl down the drain. Outside, the sound of the swamp rolled on, unbothered, eternal. He felt its rhythm again, steady and slow, but now it carried a question. The photograph was still in his hand when he looked out through the window toward the river. The line on the back echoed in his head. "Tell my daughter." He didn't know who she was, where she might be, or if she was even still alive. But Nathan Carter was a man who believed in finishing what he started, and the river, for all its silence, had just handed him a story that wasn't done. That night, as the first crickets began to sing and the mist rose again from the water, he left the box unopened on the table. It sat there like a living thing, heavy with secrets. Outside, the moon reflected on the river in fractured silver lines, and somewhere far off, a heron screamed into the dark. Nathan knew he wouldn't sleep much. Tomorrow he would find out what lay inside. But for now the swamp whispered around him, patient and watchful as if waiting for him to take the next step into its long memory. The metal box stayed on the kitchen table long after the sun had climbed to its full height. Nathan Carter had eaten his lunch without tasting it, his mind still somewhere out on the muddy bank where that strange raft lay buried. The swamp, it seemed, had followed him home. The smell of wet silt clung to his boots, and the faint tremor in his hands refused to settle. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the screen door, carrying with it the dense humidity and the sound of insects droning like wires under tension. His house stood on stilts above the slow floodplain, built by his father's hands before the war. The floorboards were seasoned with decades of river mud, and the air inside always smelled faintly of tobacco and boat oil. The single room served as kitchen, workshop, and living space, every surface crowded with the detritus of a man who spent his life between land and water. Rusted tools lined the shelf above the window, fishing lines coiled neatly beside old jars of nails and screws. Beside the sink, a tin mug filled with spoons rattled each time the wind pushed against the frame. Nathan sat in the wooden chair by the table, staring at the box as though it might open on its own. He had wiped away the thickest layer of grime, revealing the dark, bruised color of the metal beneath. The lock, corroded but intact, refused to budge when he'd tried it earlier. He ran a finger along the hinge. The edge bit cold into his skin. There were markings faintly etched into the lid, letters perhaps, but so worn that they looked like scratches. He leaned closer, trying to trace them in the light. J.B. That was all he could make out. The photograph lay beside the box, flattened between a napkin and a piece of glass to keep it from curling. The woman's face, though blurred, carried a strength that unsettled him. Her gaze was fixed on the camera, but there was a tension in her posture, as if she'd been caught in the middle of something urgent. The child in her arms, her daughter, no doubt, was bundled in a blanket, its edges barely visible under the exposure. Nathan flipped the photo over again, reading the back for the 100th time. "If anyone finds this, tell my daughter." The writing, faint and uneven, looked hurried. The words had been pressed deep into the paper, like someone desperate to make them last. He couldn't shake the sense that the plea was meant for him, though reason told him it was impossible. The message had waited buried in mud for decades, long before he was born, and yet somehow it had found its way into his hands. Maybe the swamp had chosen him. That was how the old folks talked about it, how the bayou kept secrets and decided who was worthy to hear them. Nathan had never been one for superstition, but he'd lived too long on this water to pretend it didn't have a will of its own. He stood and walked to the sink, washing the dirt from his palms, watching the brown water swirl down the drain like smoke. In the reflection on the window pane, he caught his own face, lined, weathered, eyes sunken from years of squinting against the glare. Behind that reflection, the slow movement of the river shimmered. He could almost see the shape again, that raft chained in silence, waiting for him to return. Nathan dried his hands and fetched a small hammer from the shelf. If the lock wouldn't turn, maybe it would yield to a little force. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the tool in his grip. The thought of destroying what might be evidence of something important made him pause. He set the hammer down and fetched a screwdriver instead, working the rusted latch gently. After several minutes of effort, the hinge gave a metallic sigh and the lid creaked open. Inside, the air smelled of decay and time. He found a few folded papers, their edges blackened by moisture, and something wrapped carefully in a strip of cloth. He lifted the bundle first. The fabric disintegrated at his touch, revealing a pair of small silver pocket watches. One had stopped at 247, its hands rusted in place. The other bore the faint engraving of initials that matched the lid, J.B. He placed them gently on the table and turned to the papers. Most were unreadable, the ink bled into ghostly shapes, but one corner carried a stamp. Riverline Transport Company, Baton Rouge, 1963. The date struck him harder than expected. He had been born in 1964. Whatever this was, it had happened the year before his own first breath, when his parents still lived upriver in a fishing shack smaller than this one. The swamp never forgot its dead, his father used to say. It just waited for the right time to bring them up again. Among the papers was something smaller, a fragment of a letter. Only parts of sentences remained. "They're coming. Hide what you can. Tell them I didn't steal." The rest was a blur of ink and mold. He read it twice, feeling the strange pressure of another life pressing against his own. Whoever this woman was, she had been running from someone, and if she had left her belongings chained beneath the riverbank, it meant she hadn't wanted them found. Nathan sat back, rubbing his forehead. Outside, the sound of the wind had changed. It came in short, nervous bursts through the reeds, bringing with it the faint creak of wood from the dock below. He walked to the window and looked out across the water. The river was high again, the current carrying flecks of green and brown. Nothing moved but a single egret gliding low over the surface, wings cutting through the reflection of the sky. The unease that had followed him home all morning began to thicken. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat again at the table, staring at the photograph. He needed to know who she was. Someone must have remembered her, even after all these years. In a place like this, stories never disappeared completely. They just changed shape, passed from mouth to mouth until they became half legend. Maybe one of the old-timers in town would recall a woman who vanished with her child. He thought of Clyde Wesson, his father's friend, who used to work for the local newspaper before it went under. Clyde knew every scandal that had ever touched the parish. If anyone could connect this story to a name, it would be him. Nathan took his phone from the counter and scrolled through the small list of numbers saved in it. Clyde's was near the top, though he hadn't called him in months. The man was pushing 70 now, living alone in a cabin off the main road. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the call button. What was he supposed to say? That he'd found a box in the swamp, maybe belonging to someone dead half a century? Clyde would laugh at him, or worse, tell the sheriff. But then he remembered the handwriting on the back of that photograph, and something in him hardened. He pressed the button. The call rang several times before a gravelly voice answered. Nathan introduced himself and explained carefully what he'd found. He didn't mention the raft or the chain, only the photograph and the documents. There was a long pause on the other end, then a soft exhale. "Baton Rouge, 1963, Clyde said slowly. "You said Riverline Transport. That name rings a bell." Nathan could almost hear the man sifting through memories. There was a case. Family disappeared during the floods that year. Husband worked for Riverline. Folks said he ran off with company money. His wife and baby went missing, too. They said she drowned trying to cross the bayou. Never found a body. Nathan felt the skin on the back of his neck tighten. He looked again at the photo on the table. "You remember the names?" he asked quietly. "James and Evelyn Brown," Clyde replied after a moment. "I covered it back then. Sheriff's report said the man was wanted for theft and obstruction. Some thought he was framed, but you know how things were. Big company like Riverline owned half the town. Story disappeared after a few weeks. The name Evelyn clung to him like the mist outside. It fit the face in the photograph, the tired strength in her eyes. When he hung up, he felt both closer to the truth and farther from understanding it. If this was indeed her box, then she had left it behind deliberately. And if she'd written that message, it meant she hadn't died right away. She had hoped someone would find it. The day dragged on heavy and silent. Nathan spent the afternoon cleaning his gear, but his thoughts kept circling back to the raft. Maybe there was more buried under the mud, something he'd missed. As the sun began to sink behind the cypress trees, he walked out onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath his weight. The sky had turned the color of old copper, the river reflecting the dying light in streaks of orange and black. He leaned against the railing, sipping the last of his coffee. A dragonfly hovered near his face before darting away. Everything felt too still. He could hear the distant rumble of thunder, though the air was dry. Somewhere in the reeds below, something splashed, small, deliberate. He looked down, expecting to see the ripples spread across the water, but there was nothing. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the faint creak of wood. He froze, listening. It wasn't the natural groan of the dock, it was the careful pressure of footsteps. Nathan set his cup down slowly and moved inside, glancing through the window. From the angle of the porch light, he could see the outline of his small boat tied to the post. The rope that held it looked slack, like it had been tampered with. He opened the door quietly and stepped outside. The air had thickened again. The smell of rain mingled with something else. Oil, maybe, or gasoline. He crouched near the edge and touched the rope. The fibers were freshly cut. Someone had been there. He straightened, scanning the dark tree line. The only movement was the faint shimmer of fireflies blinking in and out among the reeds. Whoever had come was gone now, or hiding. He went back inside, locking the door behind him. The box was still on the table, its lid open, the contents spread out like the remains of a confession. For the first time, the idea struck him that he might have stumbled into something larger than an old tragedy. He gathered the papers and placed them carefully back inside, closed the lid, and carried the box to his bedroom. He lifted a loose floorboard near the corner and slid the box beneath it before replacing the board. Then he turned off the lights and sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. The wind picked up again outside, rattling the tin roof. Nathan thought about the initials on the lid, the woman in the photograph, and the fragment of a letter begging to be heard across time. Maybe Clyde was right. Maybe the husband had stolen something, maybe the wife had fled. But there was something in her eyes, that mix of fear and determination, that told him the truth wasn't so simple. He lay back but didn't close his eyes. Through the floor, he could feel the faint vibration of the river below, constant and alive. The bayou had given him its secret, and now it refused to let him rest. Somewhere out there, buried under decades of silence, was the rest of Evelyn Brown's story. And Nathan knew, with a heaviness that felt almost like duty, that he wouldn't be able to walk away from it. When sleep finally came, it was shallow and uneasy. In his dream, the riverbank rose like a breathing thing, the mud pulsing with a heartbeat. He saw the raft again, the chains gleaming wet in the moonlight, and heard the whisper of a woman's voice repeating the same phrase over and over. "Tell my daughter." When he woke before dawn, the air was still and the first light was creeping through the shutters. He sat up, his heart pounding, and realized he'd already decided what he would do next. He would go back to the swamp. He would find out what else it had buried. And this time, he wouldn't be alone. The next morning dawned with a heavy fog rolling low across the river, blurring the outlines of trees until they looked like half-remembered ghosts. Nathan Carter stood on the porch, mug in hand, and watched the slow drift of mist wrap around his boat as if the bayou were trying to claim it again. He hadn't slept much. Every creak of the house, every sigh of wind through the screens had kept him awake, his mind circling the same questions over and over. Who had come near his dock last night? And why? He'd spent most of his life believing the swamp kept its dangers visible. Gators, storms, currents, things a man could see and guard against. But this was different. Whatever had brushed the edge of his world now moved in shadows, like an echo of something long buried that had decided it wasn't finished with the living yet. He finished his coffee and went back inside, his boots thudding softly against the floorboards. The house was dim, lit only by the gray morning light slipping between the slats of the shutters. The floorboard under the corner of his bed hid the metal box, but Nathan could almost feel it through the wood, the weight of its contents pressing against the quiet, patient waiting. He told himself again he wouldn't open it further until he knew what he was dealing with. He'd already pried too much into something that wasn't meant for him, and yet curiosity had already taken root. He gathered a few things, his notebook, a small camera, and an old folder he used for receipts, and packed them into a canvas bag. He planned to drive into town that morning, to the parish archive, to look through old records. It was something he hadn't done in years. Most men of his kind didn't need to look at paper to know history. They carried it in memory through stories told over a drink or on long nights by the fire. But the kind of story he'd stumbled on was one that memory had tried to erase. By the time he reached the small library, the fog had lifted enough to reveal the edges of the road. The building stood squat and sun-faded beside the courthouse, its sign half eaten away by rust. He parked under the drooping branches of an oak tree, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. Inside, the place smelled of dust and ink, and something faintly sweet, like dried glue. The librarian, a quiet woman with thin glasses, looked up when he entered but said nothing. She had seen Nathan before, years ago, when his father died and he came looking for land records. She simply nodded and went back to her catalog. The microfilm machines hummed in the back corner, relics from another time. Nathan slipped into the seat, the stool creaking beneath his weight. He pulled one of the rolls labeled Parish Chronicle, 1960-1965, and began to scroll. The images flickered under the lens: small-town stories, faded ads, lost pets, church socials, the ordinary noise of life captured in type. And then, half a reel later, he saw it. Family vanishes in storm. Riverline employee missing. The headline stretched across the top of the page in uneven black letters. Beneath it, a photograph, grainy and water-damaged, showed a young man in work clothes standing beside a barge. James Brown, age 32, technician for Riverline Transport Company, is presumed missing after the loss of 2 vessels during last week's flood. His wife Evelyn and their infant daughter have not been located. Authorities suspect foul play. Nathan leaned closer. The article continued with quotes from company officials denying any wrongdoing, calling Brown a loyal employee, but the subtext was clear. The man had been blamed for something. Another short column the next week carried an update. Search called off. No bodies recovered, and then nothing. The story simply stopped. As Clyde had said, it had vanished from public attention as quickly as it appeared. He printed a few copies and returned to his truck, sitting for a long moment with the engine off. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, not from the wind, but from the steady pulse of his own nerves. Something about the way the company's name kept reappearing unsettled him. River Line Transport. He'd heard it mentioned around Baton Rouge when he was younger, usually in the same breath as rumors about smuggling and bribes. The company had collapsed in the late 70s after a scandal involving unregistered shipments. If James Brown had been mixed up in that world, whether willingly or not, it explained why someone might still care enough to keep the past buried. Before heading home, Nathan stopped at a small diner on the edge of town, a place where fishermen and truckers ate before the heat of the day made work unbearable. He ordered black coffee and sat in a corner booth, the newspaper copies folded on the table in front of him. As he waited, he noticed an old man sitting a few stools down, his cap low, a cigarette trembling between his fingers. Nathan recognized him. It was Raymond Wells, who had once run the machine shop by the docks. His memory was said to be sharper than most men half his age. Nathan approached, greeting him quietly. Raymond squinted through the smoke and nodded. They spoke of simple things at first: weather, fishing, how the marshes were worse this season, until Nathan steered the conversation toward the past. When he mentioned River Line, the old man's eyes flickered with something like recognition, then caution. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and muttered, "That company brought more trouble than fish to these waters." Nathan pressed gently, asking if he'd ever heard of a man named Brown. For a moment, the man's face softened. Jimmy Brown, sure. Worked the pumps down by the freight yard, quiet fella, didn't drink, didn't talk. Then one day he just up and disappeared. Folks said he ran off with money that wasn't his. But I heard different. Nathan leaned forward, his heart quickening. Different how? Raymond looked around the diner, lowering his voice. Couple of days before the flood, Jimmy came by the shop asking if I could fix a small engine for a raft. Said he needed it done quick, paid cash. When I asked what for, he just smiled, said he was taking his family somewhere safer. That same night, 2 men came looking for him. One of them had a scar on his ear right here. He pointed with a trembling finger. Never forget a face like that. They said he stole something. Next day, the storm hit, and Jimmy was gone. Nathan thanked him and paid for both coffees, his mind racing. A scar on his ear. A man looking for someone just before a disappearance. The details matched too well to be coincidence. As he walked out of the diner, he couldn't shake the feeling that the swamp wasn't finished telling its story. The drive home felt longer than usual. The sun had burned through the mist by now, leaving the sky pale and hard. He turned off the highway onto the dirt road that led toward his property, the tires crunching over gravel. When he pulled up beside his house, the first thing he noticed was that the gate to his dock was open. He was sure he had closed it that morning. He stepped out slowly, scanning the yard. Everything looked ordinary. The same tools by the shed, the same pile of nets by the porch. But the sense of order felt forced, like someone had moved things back just enough to disguise their presence. He went inside, his pulse quickening. The air inside the house was still, but something in it had changed, a faint scent of sweat and tobacco that wasn't his. The chair by the window was pulled slightly out of place. He moved to the bedroom and knelt by the loose floorboard. The nails looked untouched, but when he lifted it carefully, he saw what he feared. The box was there, but its lid sat open a fraction of an inch. Someone had been inside. He lifted it out, heart pounding, and checked the contents. The watches were still there, but the letter fragment, the one that mentioned hiding something, was gone. Nathan's throat tightened. Whoever had come here wasn't just curious. They were searching for something specific, something they believed still existed after all these years. He thought of the cut rope on his boat, the footsteps on the dock, the way the old story had disappeared from the newspapers. It all fit together in a pattern he didn't want to see. The past wasn't just whispering, it was moving. He put the box back and sealed the floorboard. Then he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the photograph again. The woman's expression seemed different now, less pleading, more knowing. He wondered what she had hidden that was worth coming back for, even after decades. Money, documents, evidence that could still ruin someone powerful enough to send strangers creeping through his yard in the night. By late afternoon, the wind had risen again, thick with the smell of rain. Nathan drove to Clyde's cabin before the storm broke. The old journalist lived alone off a narrow gravel road that wound between cypress groves. His porch was cluttered with boxes of old papers and yellowed photographs. When Nathan arrived, Clyde was sitting in a rocker, pipe in hand, reading through a stack of clippings. Clyde listened quietly as Nathan told him everything: the raft, the box, the letter, and now the missing page. His weathered face didn't show surprise, only a slow nod, as if he had been expecting the story to resurface someday. "I told you, son," he said finally. "Some stories don't stay buried. Riverline was mixed up in things bigger than this town could imagine. Illegal shipments, government contracts, even rumors of payoffs to local law. If James Brown knew too much, they couldn't let him talk." Nathan asked what he should do, whether to go to the police, but Clyde shook his head. "You won't get far with them. Some of the same families that ran Riverline still have friends on the force. If you want the truth, you'll have to find it yourself. Start with the company archives if any survived, or find people who worked there. But be careful. If someone broke into your place already, they know you've got something." The rain began to fall in slow, heavy drops, tapping against the porch roof. Nathan felt the chill spread through him, not from the weather, but from the realization that Clyde was right. He was in the middle of something dangerous, something that reached beyond his quiet patch of river. He left the cabin before nightfall, driving through sheets of rain that blurred the road ahead. When he reached his house, lightning was flashing over the bayou, the sky split open in white veins. He ran inside, drenched, locking the door behind him. For a moment, he just stood there, catching his breath, listening to the storm roar outside. Then, faintly beneath the thunder, he heard another sound, the hollow clink of metal against wood coming from under the house. He grabbed the flashlight from the counter and stepped onto the porch, heart hammering. The wind whipped at his shirt, rain slanting across his face. He crouched near the edge of the stilts, shining the light down into the shadows beneath the floorboards. For a moment, he saw nothing but the churned mud below, then a flicker, the edge of a chain hanging loose where the support beam met the ground. It swayed slightly, as though someone had brushed against it moments before. He lowered the light and waited, breath shallow. The storm roared on, the sound of the rain masking everything else. But deep down, in the spaces between the thunder, he could swear he heard footsteps retreating into the dark water. He stood there for a long time, staring into the emptiness, until the chain stopped moving and the only sound left was the rain hammering against the river. That night, Nathan couldn't bring himself to sleep. He sat by the window, watching the storm move east, and thought of the photograph again. The mother, the child, and the message she had left for a world that had forgotten her. Somewhere beyond the veil of rain, buried in the shifting mud of the swamp, lay the rest of her story. And now, he knew for certain that there were others who didn't want it to be told. But Nathan had never been the kind of man to walk away once he'd begun something. He owed it to her, and maybe to himself, to see it through. When the storm finally broke near dawn, he rose from his chair, his eyes red from exhaustion, but his resolve sharpened. The swamp was still there, vast and silent, holding its secrets close, but it had given him enough clues to follow. Somewhere in its tangle of roots and waterlogged earth, the past was waiting to be found, and Nathan was no longer afraid to wade into it. By dawn, the storm had drained itself into silence. The air that followed was heavy, clean, and pale with fog. Nathan Carter stepped outside with the same weary calm he carried after every long night. But this time he wasn't simply tired. The stillness unnerved him. The river that usually murmured with life now moved like glass. Even the birds were slow to wake, as if the swamp itself held its breath, waiting for him to decide what to do next. He had made his choice long before sunrise. Whatever haunted that muddy riverbank, whatever those men had been searching for under his floorboards, he needed to see it again with his own eyes. The photograph and the half-ruined letter had only deepened the mystery. Now, after the night's intrusion, it felt like an obligation, as if the woman in the picture had pressed her story into his hands, refusing to be forgotten. Nathan filled his thermos, packed a flashlight, gloves, and a tarp into his satchel, and climbed down the damp steps to his boat. The world was still gray, the outlines of the trees swallowed by mist. He pushed off quietly, letting the current guide him through the narrow channels he knew by memory. The oar dipped soundlessly into the water. Every few strokes he looked back, half expecting another shadow to emerge from the fog behind him, a reflection that wasn't his own. When he reached the cove, the water had dropped another inch since the storm. The shape was still there, pressed into the mud as though the river were reluctant to release it. The raft's edges were clearer now, thick timbers, blackened by age, bound with loops of iron chain that glimmered faintly under the dim light. He pulled the boat to shore and stepped out, his boots sinking ankle-deep in the silt. The smell of decay was strong, metallic, but beneath it lingered something older, wood and oil, perhaps from the raft itself. Nathan crouched and brushed the mud away from one corner. The boards beneath were smooth, hand-cut. Whoever had built it had known what they were doing. This was no accident of driftwood. The planks ran parallel, evenly spaced, reinforced by crossbeams bolted with square nails. He imagined a man building it in haste, every movement filled with purpose, perhaps fear. He thought of James Brown, the missing technician working by lantern light while the storm clouds gathered, assembling a last chance to save his family. Nathan began to map it in his notebook, the length, width, the direction it faced. He traced the rusted chain that looped around the nearest cypress trunk. It wasn't tangled, it was tied deliberately, in a way that would keep the raft from floating off but still allow it to rise with the tide. The precision chilled him. It was as if someone had anchored not just wood, but a moment in time. He scraped away more mud, uncovering remnants of cloth, thin burlap fibers that disintegrated when touched. Near the edge, a cluster of nails formed a pattern, maybe where a crate or small box had once been fastened. He followed the marks, finding faint impressions beneath the silt, like shadows of what had once been there. It made sense now why the metal box had been chained in place. Whoever left it wanted it to remain hidden until the water chose to give it up. Nathan worked methodically for hours, losing track of time. The sun rose behind the fog, turning the air from silver to gold. He uncovered a section of the raft's underside, where the mud was thinner, and found another chain. This one snapped. He ran his fingers along its rough links. The break looked deliberate, as if someone had tried to free the raft quickly. For a moment, he imagined the scene: Evelyn clutching her child, the water rising fast, the roar of thunder overhead. Someone cutting the chain in desperation while another shouted from the trees. The image felt too vivid, too close. As he straightened, movement in the reeds caught his eye. A flash of color, then stillness. He waited, muscles tensed, listening. A frog croaked somewhere behind him, and the ripples subsided. The bayou was playing tricks on him again, testing his nerve. He turned back to the raft and continued his work. It was near midday when he found something else. In the soft muck near the far end, where the raft curved inward, a faint shape emerged. Not wood this time, but metal. He dug carefully with his hands until he exposed a small buckle, the kind used on belts or bags. Attached to it was a strip of leather so degraded it tore at the slightest pull. Beside it, pressed into the mud, lay a small coin, blackened and worn smooth, the year still visible. 1962. Nathan lifted it and wiped it clean. The coin gleamed briefly in the sunlight before dulling again, swallowed by oxidation. It was nothing of value, and yet he felt its weight in his palm, proof that a life had passed here. He packed the coin into his pocket and leaned back on his heels. The raft wasn't just a relic, it was evidence. Every nail, every chain told a part of the story, and yet there were gaps he couldn't fill, questions that reached beyond his knowledge of boats or rivercraft. He needed confirmation, a second pair of eyes. Someone who could read the marks the way an archaeologist reads bones. That thought brought him back to the name Clyde had mentioned the night before. A woman named Laurette May, a retired nurse who had worked near the docks in the 60s. If the name Miss L in the ruined letter referred to her, she might know something about Evelyn or the child. Nathan decided he would find her, but first he needed to document everything here. He took photos from several angles, careful not to disturb more than necessary. The raft looked almost peaceful under the weak sunlight, like a sleeping creature resting in the mud. But beneath that calm surface lay tension, a sense that this was only the beginning. He sealed his notebook and stepped back toward the boat. The air had grown warmer, the fog finally retreating, and the swamp was alive again with sound. The buzz of cicadas, the distant cry of a heron, the lazy splash of something unseen slipping into the water. Before leaving, he stood for a long moment, looking at the raft. He could feel the pull of the story beneath it, dragging him deeper than he'd planned to go. The river had always taken from him time, youth, sometimes fish, but now it had given him something in return, a thread that connected him to lives swallowed by its depths. The trip back was slow. The heat settled like a hand on his shoulders, and the boat cut through water thick with pollen and debris. When he reached the main channel, he saw a white truck parked near the access road that led to his property. It hadn't been there that morning. He slowed, watching through the veil of reeds. The truck was empty, its doors closed, no license plate on the back. A chill crept up his spine. He rowed past quietly, keeping his eyes on it until a bend in the river hid it from view. At home, the unease lingered. He secured the boat, double-checking the ropes this time, then went inside to call Clyde. The old man answered on the second ring, his voice gruff but steady. Nathan told him about the raft, the chain, the coin. Clyde listened in silence, then exhaled. "That matches what I heard," he said finally. "She didn't drown out there. She tried to escape. Someone caught up with her. If you found that chain snapped, it means they were close." Nathan asked about Lorette May. Clyde said she was still alive, living in a small care home 2 parishes over. "She's not all there anymore," he warned. "But sometimes memory slips loose when you least expect it. Bring that photo if you go. It might stir something." Nathan thanked him and hung up. He spent the evening preparing for the trip, charging his phone, printing the photograph, and sealing the box again under the floor just to be safe. But as night fell, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house made him glance toward the window. At one point, he thought he saw movement near the tree line. A faint glimmer, maybe headlights passing through the fog. He told himself it was nothing. The storm had washed away any tracks left from the night before, but not the fear. He sat by the table and opened his notebook. The sketches of the raft stared back at him, precise lines and measurements that now felt like a map leading somewhere darker. He added a few notes about the broken chain, the coin, and the pattern of nails. The act of writing calmed him, grounding the chaos in facts. He was just a fisherman, not an investigator, but the habits of patience and observation that came from years on the water served him now. Before going to bed, he checked the box one more time. Everything inside was untouched. The watches gleamed faintly in the lamplight, tiny monuments to lost time. He traced the initials again, J.B. James Brown. Whoever he had been, his silence had stretched across generations, and now Nathan had stepped into it. The night was quieter than the one before. No footsteps on the dock, no whispers under the floor. Yet, even in that stillness, he sensed motion, the slow current of truth beginning to stir. The raft had spoken, but not fully. Its broken chains and forgotten relics hinted at something larger, something that reached beyond one family's tragedy into the hidden veins of greed and fear that ran through the whole river system like oil. Before sleep claimed him, Nathan thought again of Evelyn, standing perhaps where he had stood that morning, clutching her child while the water rose. He imagined her turning to the dark line of trees, hearing voices closing in. Somewhere she had found the strength to hide her story where only the river could keep it. And now, decades later, it had chosen him to finish what she could not. The last thing he heard before drifting off was the low croak of frogs echoing across the bayou, their rhythm steady, ancient, unchanged. Outside, the water moved softly under the moonlight, brushing against the stilts of his home, a reminder that the swamp remembered everything, and that by morning it would demand another piece of the truth from him. The morning broke with a brittle kind of silence, as if even the swamp was holding its breath. Nathan Carter awoke before the first light touched the treetops, already dressed and moving about his small home in purposeful rhythm. The events of the past days had shifted something inside him, not just curiosity now, but urgency, as if a clock had started ticking and time was running out to finish a task he hadn't even meant to begin. Everything he had seen, the raft with its snapped chain, the broken buckle, the silver watches, the faded photograph, had led to one certainty. Evelyn Brown had not drowned quietly in the floodwaters of 1963. She had tried to escape something, and someone had made sure her story vanished before it could reach the surface. But not all of it had stayed buried. He packed with care, sliding the folded photograph into a weatherproof envelope and tucking it safely into a canvas satchel alongside a small flashlight, a digital voice recorder, a phone charger, and a roll of cash he rarely used. He locked the box beneath the floor again, then stepped out into the morning, his boots landing firmly on the steps with the same old creak that had greeted him every day for years. But the air today felt different. Charged. The sky above the river was low and heavy, the kind of sky that warned of rain later but promised stillness for now. He glanced once more across the water before climbing into his truck and turning onto the narrow dirt road that would carry him out of the bayou and northward, away from the place where he had lived his whole life and toward the remnants of someone else's. The road wound between dense trees and the occasional clearing where long-dead farms sagged under ivy and rot. The further he drove, the more the landscape flattened, becoming less tangled, less wild. Civilization crept in slowly, a general store here, a blinking light there, until eventually the cypress gave way to pine and the pine to asphalt. He passed through the outskirts of town without stopping, not ready yet to talk to anyone familiar. He had called Clyde before leaving, telling him briefly of his plan. The old man had given him a name and a place. Lorette May, a retired nurse who had lived in the parish for decades and now resided in a care facility in St. Landry. The note in Evelyn's letter, the faint reference to Miss L, fit. And if Lorette had known Evelyn, even briefly, even through shadows, she might hold the key to understanding why the woman had vanished, and why someone still cared enough to make sure her secret stayed hidden. It was nearly noon by the time Nathan arrived in St. Landry. The care home stood on a low hill, surrounded by rows of trimmed hedges and flowering bushes planted in neat circles. It looked peaceful, in the way that places designed to contain the past often did, quiet, efficient, designed to blur the sharp edges of memory. He parked under the shade of a wide pecan tree and walked slowly up the concrete path. Inside, the air smelled of bleach and artificial lemon, overlaying the softer notes of paper and cotton. At the front desk, he asked for Lorette May. The woman behind the counter, a nurse with tired eyes and a professional smile, nodded and motioned for him to wait. After a few minutes, she returned and led him down a hallway lined with open doors, some revealing neatly made beds and quiet figures gazing at silent televisions. Lorette sat by a window in a room filled with filtered light. Her frame was slight, almost brittle, with thin white hair pulled into a bun. She wore a lavender sweater over a pale blue gown, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look up when Nathan entered. "Miss May?" he said gently. Her head turned slightly, her gaze hazy but alert. "Yes?" "My name's Nathan Carter. I came to ask you about someone. From a long time ago, her name was Evelyn Brown." For a moment, nothing changed. Then her eyes narrowed and the faintest furrow creased her brow. She blinked once, then again. "Brown," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I remember a Brown. She came during the storm." Nathan sat carefully across from her. "You were working at the dock clinic?" Lorette nodded slowly. "Too much water that year. People sick, wounded. One woman came with a child, said she had nowhere to go. I gave her milk for the baby. She asked me to watch her girl. Said she would come back soon." Nathan's breath caught. "Did she tell you her name?" "Evelyn," Lorette said, her voice a little clearer now, like stepping back into a room she'd once known well. "She was scared. wore a dark coat, hands shaking. What happened to the child? I kept her until the parish took her, Lorette replied. She didn't come back. Nathan took the photograph from his bag and held it out. Is this her? Lorette reached with trembling fingers, took the envelope, and stared at the image for a long time. Then she pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. That's her. She had this photo, said it was for the baby, a keepsake. Nathan swallowed, his throat dry. The girl, what happened to her? They changed her name, Lorette said. Put her with a family in Georgia. All hush hush. No papers ever came back. I wrote her name down once. Grace. I think they kept Grace. It was enough, more than he had expected. Grace, a daughter who had grown up never knowing her real mother, perhaps never even knowing she had been abandoned in a storm, not out of neglect, but out of love and danger. Nathan stayed a little longer, asking for any records, but Lorette shook her head. It's all gone now, only memory. She gave him back the photograph and smiled faintly, the lines in her face deepening like roots. Tell her, she said, tell the girl, her mama tried. Outside, the light had softened, casting long shadows across the lawn. Nathan sat in his truck, staring at the dashboard, letting the weight of the conversation settle. Grace, a name, a direction. He didn't know where exactly she was, but he had enough to start. He opened his notebook and began making calls. A few leads, dead ends, until finally he reached an office in Augusta, Georgia. A kind voice on the other end confirmed a woman named Grace Monroe had once been registered as an adoptee from Louisiana in the 60s. They could not give out personal details, but he left a message explaining only that he had information about her biological mother. He didn't sleep much that night. He stayed in a roadside motel, the kind with scratchy sheets and flickering lights. He placed the photograph on the nightstand and stared at it, wondering what it would be like for someone to grow up not knowing where they came from, to feel a gap in the fabric of their life that nothing could quite fill. The next morning, just before sunrise, his phone rang. A soft voice answered when he picked up. This is Grace Monroe. Someone left a message for me. Nathan sat up. Yes, ma'am. My name is Nathan Carter. I live in Louisiana. I believe I found something that belongs to you, or at least to your mother. There was a long pause. I don't know anything about my birth mother. I think her name was Evelyn Brown, he said gently. She disappeared during a flood in 1963. She left behind a box, a photograph, a letter, another silence, then faintly. Are you sure? I am. I've seen the place where she tried to escape. I've spoken to the nurse who watched over you. There's more, but I'd rather say it in person. Grace agreed to meet. They arranged to meet in 2 days in Baton Rouge, halfway between their homes. Nathan felt the hours crawl by after that, restless with anticipation. The story had begun with a shape in the mud, but now it was becoming something living, something that could be touched and named. The meeting took place in a small coffee shop near the river. Grace was in her late 50s, her hair streaked with gray, her posture guarded. But her eyes were steady as she looked at the photograph Nathan placed before her. She didn't speak for a long time. She looks like me, she said finally. I never had any pictures. My adoptive parents were good to me, but they never knew where I came from. Nathan nodded. Your mother tried to protect you. She ran, but someone was chasing her. She left this behind so one day someone could tell you the truth. Grace traced the edges of the photo with her fingers. What happened to her? I don't know everything yet, Nathan admitted, but I think she didn't make it out. I think she was caught. There are people who tried to erase the evidence, people who may still be watching. But I also think the truth is stronger than they are. They talked for hours. He shared everything: the raft, the chain, the missing letter, the broken watch. Grace listened in silence, tears welling in her eyes. At the end, she took the photo and the letter and placed them in her purse. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding her, for finding me." Nathan left the coffee shop that day feeling something shift inside him, a knot he hadn't known he carried finally loosening. The woman from the muddy photograph now had a voice in the world again. Her daughter knew her name. Her story had been lifted from the silence of the swamp and given breath. But he also knew this wasn't over. The box had been broken into. The past was being stirred not just by him, but by others who had something to lose. Whoever they were, they had begun to move again, stirred from the long sleep of secrecy. And Nathan wasn't about to let them finish what they started. As he drove back toward the bayou, the sky opened up with rain. Thick, warm sheets of it poured down over the road, blurring the windshield and washing the dust from the trees. The river was rising again, and with it came the pull of unfinished truths. He gripped the wheel tighter and pressed forward, knowing that the swamp had one more secret to reveal, and this time he would be ready to meet it. The return journey to the bayou felt heavier than the one that had taken Nathan north. The conversations with Grace echoed in his mind, each word carefully replayed, each pause carrying the weight of generations of silence. Her voice had trembled, but not from weakness. There was a quiet resolve in her once the truth began to settle, a strength in simply knowing at last where her life had begun. But alongside that resolve had come something darker. Fear. Not of her mother, not of the past, but of what might still be watching from the shadows of that story. Nathan had seen it in her eyes before she even spoke of it. The unease was mutual. Neither of them could explain it fully, but both had felt it. Something about this story still had sharp teeth, and someone had not wanted it brought to light. Back home, the swamp welcomed him with the low hum of insects and the damp, dense heat that stuck to the skin like syrup. The road to his cabin was unchanged, winding through cypress trunks and tangled underbrush, but now it felt less like home and more like a borderland, a place where old ghosts stirred just out of sight. As he pulled into the clearing and cut the engine, Nathan sat still for a long moment, listening. There was nothing but the creaking of the trees in the breeze, and yet his skin prickled as if he were being watched. Inside the cabin, the air was stale. He set the satchel down carefully and checked the box beneath the floorboards. It was untouched, or at least it seemed so. He didn't trust appearances anymore. He opened it and examined the contents again, as if trying to sense whether something invisible had shifted in his absence. The photograph of Evelyn was still there, as was the folded letter and the rusted trinkets. But something gnawed at him, a vague sense that a part of the story still lay hidden. He pulled everything out and checked the box itself, tapping along its inner walls, inspecting the corners. Then, without knowing why, he slid his fingers under the lining at the bottom. Something caught. It was a false layer, thin and tightly wedged, just enough to hide a space beneath. With some effort, he pried it loose. Inside, nestled in the dust, was a smaller envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with brittle wax. There was no address, only a name scrawled in faded ink across the front. To my daughter. His hands trembled as he opened it. The paper within was fragile, the handwriting uneven and hurried. He sat down at the kitchen table and began to read. My Grace, if this letter finds you, it means you lived. It means they didn't get you, and that someone kind helped you find the truth. I pray for that more than I pray for my own salvation. You were so small the night I handed you over to Miss Lorette. I told you I'd be right back, but I knew I wouldn't. Not because I didn't want to. God, I would have burned the world to hold you one more time, but because they were close. Too close. And if I had stayed, they would have used you to make me talk. I couldn't risk that. Not after what your father died for. They said James was a thief, that he stole company money and fled. But the truth is uglier. He found something. Documents, records, shipments that weren't what they claimed to be. Chemicals, guns, trafficked souls, maybe. I don't know all of it, only that he was scared, and then he was dead. Hung from a beam in our shed with a note in his pocket they made him write. I know he didn't take his own life. He'd never have left us. They came for me the next day. Men in uniforms without names. Told me I'd be safer if I stayed quiet. Safer if I moved away. Disappeared. But I didn't listen. I ran with you, hoping I could reach New Orleans, find someone from the paper, someone who'd listen. But the river rose too fast. The raft was all I had. If you're reading this, then someone found that raft. Maybe they found the box. Maybe they read this and think I'm crazy. But I don't care what they think. I only care that you know I tried, that your mama didn't just vanish into the swamp without a fight. Love always, Mama. Nathan sat in silence long after the last word. The letter lay open on the table, the ink smudged slightly where his fingers had pressed against it. It explained everything, and yet left so much unsaid. The pieces were coming together now like boards nailed into a frame. The flood, the company, the cover-up. Someone had killed James Brown for what he knew, then silenced his wife, letting time and water wash over their memory. Only Grace had slipped through their fingers. A child, too young to talk, too small to be seen as a threat. Until now. He called Grace that evening. Her voice was soft but steady. I found a letter, he said. It's from her. To you. There was a pause, and then a choked, "Can you read it?" He did, slowly, carefully, his voice thick with the weight of it. When he finished, she didn't speak. He waited, giving her space. Finally, she whispered, "She knew. She knew everything, and they killed her for it." "I think so." "Do you still have the rest, the documents, anything that could prove it?" "Some," he said. "Enough, maybe. But someone's already tried to take it." "Then we need to be careful," she said. "Very careful." The next day, Nathan met with Clyde again. The old journalist was waiting for him at the same diner where they'd first spoken about Evelyn. Clyde listened to the letter with a grim expression, then leaned forward. "I knew parts of this," he admitted. Whispers, rumors about shipments coming through the docks that didn't match the logs. But no one would go on record. And when the Browns disappeared, it was like the whole story evaporated. Nathan nodded. "They made sure of that. If you're thinking of going public, you'll need more than a letter. You'll need dates, names, connections. Otherwise, it's just another sad swamp story." "I'm not just thinking of going public," Nathan said. "I'm thinking of finishing what Evelyn started." That night, as the cicadas hummed and the moon hung low over the bayou, Nathan sat by his window, the box open on the floor beside him. He sorted through its contents again, this time looking for patterns. The broken watch, the receipts, the faded ledger pages, it was all part of something bigger. Something he had to understand if he was going to survive what came next. He didn't hear the truck until it was already turning down his drive. The sound of tires on gravel broke the quiet like a slap. He stood quickly, grabbing the box and hiding it beneath the floorboards. The headlights flashed across his porch. A vehicle idling in silence. Then footsteps. One set. Heavy. Nathan reached for the baseball bat by the door and cracked it open just a hair. A man stood outside, tall, wearing a jacket too clean for the swamp. He knocked once, sharp and precise. "Mr. Carter," the man called, "we need to talk." Nathan said nothing. "It's about something you found. Something that doesn't belong to you." Still, Nathan said nothing. The man waited a few moments more, then turned and walked back to his truck. A minute later, the engine roared to life and the vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the trees. Nathan waited another 10 minutes before moving. When he finally did, he didn't feel fear. He felt confirmation. The story Evelyn had died to protect was still dangerous, which meant it was real, which meant it had to come out. He called Grace again. "They're watching me now." "Then let's finish this together," she said, "for her." The line went dead, but the message remained. Nathan stood in the darkness of his cabin, one hand resting on the floorboards that now held the past. Outside, the swamp shifted and sighed, not as a warning, but as witness. The time for silence was over. The sun had not yet risen when Nathan Carter left the main road and turned onto the dirt path that led back to the bayou. The air was damp, and the fog lay thick among the trees, curling around the cypress knees and low-hanging Spanish moss like smoke. Each step toward the river felt heavier than the last. He had traveled this path countless times, but now it seemed charged with a strange urgency, as though the swamp itself had been waiting for him to return. Every sound, the crunch of his boots on gravel, the distant croak of frogs, the slap of water against submerged roots, carried meaning. Every shadow hinted at unseen watchers, and the weight of decades-old secrets pressed against him in the damp air. Nathan paused near the bend where he had first seen the raft. The river was low, and the water moved sluggishly, heavy with silt and debris from recent rains. The raft lay in its old place, half submerged, dark and still, chains glinting faintly under the gray light. Time had eroded some of its edges, but the structure remained intact, as if the river itself had preserved it. Nathan stepped carefully into the mud, feeling the soft give beneath his boots, and knelt beside the old boards. The swamp smelled of wet wood, earth, and something metallic, the remnants of rusted iron that had not yet surrendered to decay. He ran his hands over the timbers, tracing the seams and nails, the scars of past work and hurried construction. Every detail told a story. The broken chain, the rusted bolts, the faint impressions of what had been tied to the raft long ago, it was all a record of desperation and careful planning. Nathan knew now that Evelyn Brown had left everything she could, yet had been forced to leave far more behind. The letter to her daughter, the watches, the photographs, and the metal box were pieces of a puzzle the swamp had kept hidden for decades, waiting for someone persistent enough to find them. As he worked, he uncovered more evidence of hurried escape. A length of rope frayed and cut, knots that had been tied in a rush, and a small worn leather strap that had once fastened a bundle to the deck. Each piece revealed a fragment of the night when Evelyn had tried to flee with her child. Nathan imagined the storm rising, water surging, the dark shapes of men pressing close. He could feel the tension in the boards, the way the wood had been reinforced to carry a small life across treacherous water. The raft was more than wood and iron. It was a vessel of survival, a vessel of secrets, and a witness to events that had been hidden beneath layers of mud and time. He took photographs of every detail, documenting the chains, the fastenings, and the impressions of what had been tied to the raft. He worked methodically, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily, understanding that every mark was a clue. The swamp around him remained quiet, the usual chorus of frogs and insects subdued, as if nature itself was aware of the importance of this moment. Nathan's hands grew raw from the mud, his knees caked with silt, but he did not pause. He was aware that whoever had come to the cabin in the last days had not been casual visitors. The presence of others, the cut rope on his boat, and the broken letter in the box all pointed to people still invested in keeping the past buried. Hours passed. The sun climbed slowly, filtering through the mist and casting long shadows across the water. Nathan moved along the raft, inspecting every plank and chain. He found a small piece of metal, bent and jagged, embedded in the mud beneath one of the timbers. He recognized it as a part of a latch, possibly from the box or another container that had been tied to the raft. The thought that there could be more hidden nearby urged him forward, deeper into the swamp, away from the main path, following the subtle rise and fall of the land, the faint impressions left by decades of water movement. He reached the far end of the raft where the mud was softest. Using a small spade he had brought, Nathan began to carefully excavate around a cluster of timbers. Hours of patient digging revealed another container, long buried, covered with layers of mud and silt. It was smaller than the metal box he had retrieved before, but clearly deliberate, a rectangle of wood reinforced with iron straps. He paused, breathing heavily, his hands trembling as he brushed away the final layer of grime. The container yielded a faint metallic scent as he lifted it, the smell of rust and something older, something preserved by water. Nathan placed the new box beside the raft and examined it closely. The construction was precise, deliberate, matching the care taken with the first container. There were scratches along the edges, probably from being dragged or tied to the raft. The wood was swollen from water, but the iron straps held firm. He recognized the significance immediately. Evelyn Brown had hidden multiple pieces of her story, each designed to survive the passage of time and water, each left to be discovered by someone who would understand. He worked with meticulous care to open the box. Inside were papers bound carefully in cloth, some faded, some smudged with age. Among them were more photographs, documents from Riverline Transport, and a small journal in Evelyn's hand. Nathan's eyes widened as he examined the journal. The entries were brief, coded, and desperate. They chronicled not only the night of the flood, but the events leading up to it, the threats from men associated with the company, James Brown's discovery of irregular shipments, and the perilous plan to escape with their child. Each entry added texture to the story, revealing the depth of fear, love, and strategy that Evelyn had carried. Nathan carefully cataloged the items, taking photographs, making notes, and ensuring nothing was disturbed beyond necessity. He realized that the journal held the key to connecting the fragments he had collected. The photograph, the letter, the watches, and now these documents. It was the roadmap of a life interrupted, a guide for reconstructing the events of decades ago. Each detail added weight to the narrative, showing the calculated measures Evelyn had taken to protect her child and preserve the truth, even in the face of mortal danger. As the day advanced, the fog lifted and the sun cast sharp angles across the swamp, illuminating the intricate patterns of mud, roots, and water channels. Nathan stood for a moment, absorbing the scene, feeling the enormity of what lay before him. The raft, the boxes, the documents, all were pieces of a life that had fought to survive beyond the reach of those who would bury it. He felt a solemn connection to Evelyn and to the child she had left behind, understanding that the swamp had entrusted him with something profound, something that demanded patience, care, and resolve. Nathan packed the contents carefully, securing them for transport, but he did not move immediately. He lingered by the water, watching the currents shift and swirl, imagining the night in 1963 when Evelyn had navigated these same channels, holding her child, racing against men and the flood. The thought brought a knot of grief to his chest, the weight of history pressing down with every sound of water against wood, every whisper of wind through the trees. Then he noticed movement in the distance, a flash of black and the faint outline of a vehicle between the trees. Nathan froze, his mind sharpening instantly. The swamp had already shown him that others were watching, that someone was invested in keeping these secrets buried. He moved slowly to a position where he could observe without being seen, crouching behind a fallen log, listening. The vehicle remained still for a moment, then moved slowly down the path toward the main road. Whoever it was, they were surveying, not attacking, yet. Nathan exhaled and allowed himself a moment of focus. The discoveries he had made today were critical, but now he understood the full scale of the danger. The story was larger than he had imagined, and others were invested in ensuring it remained hidden. He made the decision to move carefully, to transport the materials without attracting attention, and to begin documenting everything in a secure, methodical way. As evening fell, the swamp darkened around him. The air was thick, carrying the scents of wet wood and moss, and the low hum of insects resumed, slower now, deliberate. Nathan prepared to move the boxes to a safer location. He packed them into the boat, securing each piece carefully, and pushed off into the water. The current carried him slowly downstream, and he watched the river's edge with constant vigilance. Each bend, each shadowed root, seemed to hold a secret, and he moved with the awareness that every step could reveal watchers unseen. The journey back to his cabin was slow, careful. Nathan reflected on the enormity of what he had uncovered: the raft, the letters, the documents, the photographs, and the journal. Each element connected to a life lived in desperation, a mother fighting to protect her child from forces she could not control. He understood that the past was not inert. It had momentum, influence, and danger, even now, decades later. When he finally reached his home, the swamp was cloaked in darkness, the moon casting pale light through the branches. Nathan secured the boat and carried the boxes inside. He placed them carefully beneath the floorboards once more, ensuring that each one was hidden, yet accessible, cataloged, and intact. For a long time he sat by the window, listening to the sounds of the swamp, feeling the weight of the story settle around him. The past had finally returned in full, and he was its custodian. He understood that the story was not yet complete. There were still loose threads, people who had survived, secrets that might still be threatened, and a daughter who needed to know the truth in its entirety. But, for the first time, he also knew that he was not alone. Grace had been located, the letter delivered, and the connections were forming. The swamp had yielded its secrets to the persistent and the patient, and now it was up to Nathan to ensure they were preserved, understood, and eventually shared. The night deepened, the river flowing quietly beneath the moonlight, reflecting the stars and fractured silver streaks. Nathan sat in his chair, exhausted but alert, knowing that the bayou had given him its trust. The pieces were in place, the evidence gathered, and the story waiting to be told. He understood the gravity of that responsibility, the danger, and the necessity of care. The river moved on, slow and eternal, and Nathan allowed himself a moment to breathe, knowing that tomorrow he would begin the next stage, connecting the past fully to the present, ensuring that Evelyn's story would not be silenced again. He leaned back in his chair and listened to the night. The swamp murmured around him, patient and knowing, as it had for decades. The truth had been uncovered, but it was alive, moving, and waiting for the right hands to carry it to safety. Nathan closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to commit every detail, every sound, every shadow to memory. The river had delivered its secrets, and he would honor them. The past had returned, and with it the promise of resolution, justice, and remembrance. If you loved this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next unbelievable discoveries. Hit the like button and share this video with friends. They won't believe what happens next. Make sure to check out our other videos for more shocking secrets and hidden stories that will leave you speechless. Stay tuned, because the next revelation could be even bigger than this one.